Good morning. Our lesson, as you know, is from 2 Samuel chapter 24 and beginning with verse 18. Now with this verse, we walk right into the middle of a story. It's a story that involves a 3-day plague. This plague has already killed thousands, and it's about to hit the city of Jerusalem, the holy city. Furthermore, David, the king, thinks that this plague is a result of his own sin. Now, what terrible sin might this have been? Well, it was the sin of calling for a census. Hello? A census? What's so terrible about that? Well, whatever you think about the pros and cons of our census as we have it in our country today, a census back then was a census that counted males 20 years and older who could bear arms. It typically was preparation for conscription, bringing people into the military and preparing for war or the possibility of war. So it called for real sacrifice on the part of these males and also on the rest of the population. Furthermore, because the military was regarded in these days as a sacred vocation, the census itself involved elaborate rites of purification. And if there were any shortcuts made or any mistakes made in these rituals of purification, people believed that there could be very serious consequences, such as a plague. Well, there was a census, and now there is a plague, and they make the connection between the two. So now we're at verse 18, where the prophet Gad, who is a spiritual advisor or spiritual guide to King David, tells David what he is to do. The pestilence or the plague is portrayed or pictured in this chapter as an angel of the Lord, and that angel is right at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Now, Jebusites were non-Israelite residents of Jerusalem and its environments. And he was right just north of the north wall of the holy city. And this plague was right there, ready to hit the city. And the prophet tells King David that he needs to buy that threshing floor, and he needs to set up an altar there and make sacrifices to the Lord. And so that's what David sets out to do. And so he goes to the threshing floor. Araunah the Jebusite sees him coming and comes out himself. And so he bows down and prostrates himself before King David. Now this was a common expression of reverence at the time, but because it was common doesn't mean that it wasn't sincere. Well, David explains to Araunah the Jebusite the reason why he has come. And so I want to pick up with you and read a little bit. I'm going to be reading from the Tanakh, which is the modern Jewish scholar translation of these verses. So the wording may not be exactly what you have in front of you. But David explains that he wants to take this place where the Jebusite makes a living and buy it and make it into a holy place, into a place of sacrifice to the Lord. And so here's Araunah's response. And Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take it and offer up whatever he sees fit. Here are oxen for a burnt offering, and the threshing boards, and the gear of the oxen for wood." Now threshing boards were large, big boards that had stones attached to them underneath, and they were scraped across the floor to thresh the grain. He was offering not only his place of livelihood, but he was offering the equipment and the animals that he had so that David could do what he proposed to do. And he adds these words from verse 23, "All this, O King Araunah, gives to your majesty. And may the Lord your God," Araunah added, "respond to you with favor." Wow, these are gracious words. They may not be words that should be taken literally, because there was a way of bargaining in ancient times in the Orient, And words like these were used as the opening gambit. So it was a way to set a very positive, gracious atmosphere, but it wasn't necessarily the last word, and it didn't make the deal complete. But here's the king's response, and here we get this in verse 24. But the king replied to Araunah, "No, I will buy them from you at a price. I cannot sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that have cost me nothing." So the king cuts through all this back and forth thing that a negotiation might involve and says, "Let me give a price." And we're told here that the price paid was 50 shekels of silver. Now, over in Chronicles, we have a different account of the same event, same people, and so forth. But the amount given was not 50 shekels of silver, but 600 shekels, and these shekels were shekels of gold. Now, there's a big gap between 50 shekels of silver and 600 shekels of gold. I can't explain it by any means, but let me say that if there was a middleman, he did rather well, I dare say. In any case, the price was made. This secular place of earning a living now becomes a holy place, and a place where sacrifice is made, and it did cost. And then the last verse tells us that the plague against Israel was checked, and there were no more lives taken. So this is our story, and it closes out the second book of Samuel. And so I want to leave you with a few questions. You're probably going to have your own to discuss in your class, but let me add a few questions that you might think of for discussion. First off, when in your life has the cost or the effort you put into something made it more meaningful and worthwhile? And that cost or what you put into it is precisely what helped make it so meaningful and worthwhile for you. And how about our worship of God? How meaningful is our worship of God? And is its worth to us related to the cost, related to what we put into it? Here's another question, a similar one. When in your life, even in your everyday life, when has common space become sacred space? Now, this story tells us about the cost that King David paid to convert or transform this space. It also tells us about the result that it had, the benefit, if you will, that it had. But this is not a cost-benefit analysis. This is simply the telling of a full story. So finally, I want to close with this question. When it comes to cost, the cost of discipleship, the cost of authentic worship, the cost of following Jesus, and at the same time, the experience of grace, grace that may or may not seem to be related to cost, but a grace that blesses and renews life irrespective of cost. Well, what is your story? What is your story of cost and your story of grace? And what is your story as you wish it were? And finally, what is the cost and the grace story in the life of St. John's, our church? Perhaps in dialogue together, we can come close to telling the full story. Thank you.